The season 2 of Yellowjackets is finally coming out in March, and if you haven't already watched the first part of this show, you better do, because you don't want to miss out on Showtime's gripping new thriller series. Yellowjackets was revered by critics as one of the best series of 2021. In fact, this arc survival series has been described by The New Yorker as a series full of horror and hormones, grief and gore. It follows a high school girls soccer team that is on its way to winning the national championship when all hell breaks free. Their plane crashes on the route to the tournament, and the team is forced to do whatever it takes to live, resorting to some unsettling and brutal acts that appear almost too extreme to be true. The first season even teased the notion of cannibalism for the next season. Now, every viewer who has already watched the show has thought at least once about the show being based on reality. Well, the truth is just as disturbing as the show. Although the show is not entirely based on a true story, it certainly seems to be inspired by two very similar incidents. So sit tight as we walk you through the tragic incidents that inspired this show. Starting off with the first one, the Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, aka the Miracle in the Andes. Just like the series, the real-life incident from 1972 involves a team in a plane crash. The Uruguayan Air Force Fairchild FH-227D, which was 4 years old at the time, was chartered by the Old Christians Club rugby union team to transport its members and family to Santiago to play a match against the English Old Boys Club. The twin-engine turboprop took off from Montevideo Airport on October 12th, but the team had to halt in Argentina for the night owing to a storm. With 40 passengers and 5 crew members, the plane took off at 14:18 the next day, and the pilots opted to fly south to the Pass of Planchon. Pilot Julio Ferradas, who had flown 29 times across the Andes, was instructing a co-pilot, Dante Lagarara, but bad weather struck, causing disorientation and severe turbulence. The plane struck one of the mountains and lost its right and left wings and tail upon the impact. 13 of the 45 passengers would perish before nightfall, with many of them dying instantly in the crash amid brutal scenes. 4 aircraft were deployed to scout the Andes until dark, but they concluded it must have crashed into an inaccessible area of the mountain terrain. The search parties had no idea their planes had passed over the accident scene several times, but the Fairchild had blended in with the snow due to its white roof. They ended their search after 8 days with many helicopters on the lookout, concluding that all of the passengers had died. But there were in fact 32 survivors on the first night, and now begins the story of their survival. Or shall we say the story of their long, hope-filled wait that led to nothing but death for some. To remain warm, passengers removed the seats from the fuselage, converting it into a shelter. They even crammed into a small area, insulating themselves with bags and broken debris. But it was all in vain, as one more passenger died a few days later. The remaining survivors discovered a radio, which indicated that the search had been called off, leaving them with little hope. Together, the passengers shared 8 chocolate bars, a tin of mussels, 3 jars of jam, almonds, dates, candies, dried plums, and wine. Then, on October 29th, an avalanche hit the crash site, killing 8 more people. Ironically, although, the avalanche trapped the remaining survivors. It helped keep them safe from a blizzard. The survivors then found themselves stranded in a barren wasteland with no vegetation or wildlife in sight. Facing extreme weather conditions, critical injuries, and dwindling supplies of food and water, it became clear that the only way they could survive was to resort to cannibalism, a decision that was unimaginable for most. Despite their Christian faith and the hopes of reuniting with their families, the survivors were forced to confront the brutal reality of their situation. They agreed that if it was their own body that had died, they would want the others to eat them too, in order to survive. As days turned into weeks, the survivors resorted to eating almost every part of the dead passengers' bodies, including the liver, heart, kidneys, and intestines. It was a gruesome and revolting task that required them to overcome their mental and emotional barriers. One of the survivors, Canessa, knew that the liver contained a reserve of vitamins, so he encouraged others to eat it. They even dried the sheets of fat in the sun, forming a crust that could be eaten by everyone. Despite the horror of their situation, the survivors maintained a sense of discipline and order. They rationed their limited food and water resources, and one body was usually completed before starting another. The victims' lungs, skin, heads, and genitals were thrown away because they were deemed inedible. although some of this would later be relied on for food when stockpiles dwindled. With no hope of being found, the survivors sent out their own expedition in search of help. For 3 days, Nando Parado, Antonio Tintin Vizintin, and Canessa traveled the difficult terrain, although Vizintin would soon return to the crash scene since the crew had not brought enough food. Finally, after Parado and Canessa hiked for 9 more days, confident they would die, they reached a valley and eventually saw men on horseback. The Chilean Air Force rescued half of the survivors the next day, December 22nd, and evacuated the remainder the next day, December 23rd. The story of this kind of survival exploded in international headlines, and to no surprise, many books have been published on the event. And in 1993, a film adaptation called Alive was released. Perhaps most chillingly, it was later discovered that had the boys instead taken a different path they had considered, they would have come across a road within 3 days. Meanwhile, only 5 miles to the east of the plane wreck was a hotel, which, although closed for the season, was stocked with supplies of tinned food. Moving on, let's talk about the second incident, that is, the Donner Party. This tale started off, as all great tragedies do, with hope. It was set up in Springfield, Illinois in 1846, when the trending new thing was uprooting your whole goddamn life and traveling in numbers, 2,500 miles west, to find the promise of an unfamiliar place with less developed infrastructure, California. On May 12, 1846, the Donner Party set off west after a stop in Independence, Missouri, to acquire food and reunite the entire company. The company of 87 pioneers was led by 2 brothers, Jacob and George Donner, after whom the party was named, and an Irish businessman called James Reed, and comprised men, women, and numerous little children. By then, however, they'd already made a fatal mistake. Simply put, the Donner Party left too late. Pioneers like them intended to stick to a strict timetable, departing in mid to late April to guarantee that their pack animals had plenty of grass to eat before the coldest months came. Traveling later than mid-April means they may still be traveling in the ruthless cold. Perhaps well aware of their late start, the pioneers opted to take a shortcut known as the Hastings Cutoff. As most wagon trains circled north via Iowa, Lansford Hastings, a guidebook author, believed a more direct path existed. He, of course, named the road after himself. But there was one problem. Hastings had never actually taken his own path. George was advised by others against taking the shortcut, but he insisted on pressing ahead, as it would get him to California before all the land was sold to others. Instead of heading north, the Donner Party remained west, and ultimately headed to their demise. They quickly realized their error as they reached the Hastings Cutoff. They had to traverse the Wasatch Mountains and hike over the Salt Lake Desert instead of following the well-worn pathways of the California Trail. Navigating the Hastings Cutoff was challenging enough. Because there was no track, the pioneers had to carve a passage through the wilderness for their wagons. Several nearly died of thirst on the 5-day journey over the Salt Desert. Needless to say, the Hastings Cutoff robbed the Donner Party of critical days on their expedition. Because of this delay, as well as their late departure, they arrived at the Sierra Nevada mountains in November. Had they left even 2 days earlier, they may have made it through the terrains. Instead, they got stuck in a blizzard. The Donner Party had only 100 miles to go at this time. But moving ahead was impossible due to snowdrifts as tall as 25 feet. So they camped at Truckee Lake and hoped to make it through the long, bitter winter. So stranded in the Sierra Nevadas, they ate anything they could. They murdered their pack animals first, because they'd already depleted the majority of their food on the lengthy voyage. They drank bone marrow and tried to make an edible paste from animal skins to stretch out the meal. Then, they killed field mice and even their own loyal dogs. The desperate pioneers even nibbled on pine cones and tree bark since they couldn't find any more animals to eat. It was not nearly enough, and it didn't escape anyone's attention that there was an alternative food source nearby: the bodies of those who had perished, whom the pioneers had buried in a snowbank. So deep into their desperate winter, the Donner Party's cannibalism began. According to one version by Michael Wallace, a young lady called Sarah Murphy Foster had only just begun to grieve her brother, Lemuel, when she discovered that other pioneers were eating his heart. Several members of the Donner Party survived the winter by eating the fallen, and were located by a series of staggered rescue expeditions from February 16th to April 17th. Each party rescued various sets of people, yet they all encountered the same horrors. On February 19th, the first party arrived at Donner Lake and discovered 12 dead and 48 survivors clinging to life and sanity. Weeks later, another rescue crew arrived and found further signs of cannibalism. The rescue was then sabotaged by yet another snowstorm and had to abandon others in the starved camp. A third rescue party would soon arrive, and this time found that the body of Isaac Donner, son of Jacob, had also been eaten. The Donner Party's tragedy exposed the immense risks inherent in the great overland trip, yet it did nothing to stop its use. Even the survivors encouraged others to join them on the voyage. In a letter to her cousin in Illinois, Virginia Reed recounted that, "I have not wrote you half of the trouble, but I have wrote you enough to let you know what trouble is," before concluding, "Don't let this letter dishearten anybody. Never take no cutoffs, and hurry along as fast as you can." Well, now you know both gruesome stories. Though not fully based on these disasters, Yellowjackets has many similar themes. The group of sports players, the plane crash, the cold climate, and violent, cannibalistic actions are all paralleled and captured in the most horrific yet hooking manner in the series, which means it is, in fact, loosely based on reality. Does that send a shiver down your spine? Share your thoughts with us. Also, share this video with others to let them know of the horrific background behind the popular series, and subscribe to our page. See you next time. Peace.